The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees as Sophie leaned back against a log, sipping her thermos of hot cocoa. The night air in the Rockies was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. She exhaled deeply, savoring the quiet isolation of the forest. No emails, no traffic, no distractions, just her, the stars, and the rhythmic symphony of nature. She had done this dozens of times before, but tonight felt different, almost too quiet. Her dog-eared copy of Walden sat on her lap, but her attention drifted to the darkness beyond the firelight. Every sound seemed magnified, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. The quiet was meant to be calming, yet a prickle of unease settled at the base of her neck. Sophie shook her head, trying to dismiss it. "Get a grip," she muttered under her breath. "You're imagining things." She stood up, stretched, and glanced at her campsite. The tent was neatly pitched about 10 feet from the fire, and her bear canister was secured 50 yards away, tucked between some rocks. She had followed every rule: no food in the tent, cooking done well away from her sleeping area. It was second nature by now. Grabbing her headlamp, Sophie stepped away from the fire to relieve herself behind a cluster of bushes. The beam of light illuminated the forest floor, casting long, spindly shadows that seemed to dance with her every step. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in a puddle, her face pale and serious. "Chill out, Sophie," she whispered. "You've got this." As she returned to the fire, a faint sound carried through the trees, a low, almost imperceptible rustling. She paused, her breath catching. It wasn't the wind, she was sure of that. Her eyes scanned the darkness beyond the flickering firelight, but she saw nothing. "Probably a squirrel," she said aloud, trying to convince herself. Her voice sounded hollow in the stillness. She tossed another log onto the fire, watching the sparks fly upward, and sat back down, her body tense. The sound came again, closer this time. Sophie's pulse quickened. She instinctively reached for the bear spray clipped to her belt, her fingers trembling slightly. "All right, whatever you are, stay out there," she muttered, scanning the perimeter. Suddenly a sharp snap echoed from the woods, a branch breaking under something heavy. Sophie shot to her feet, the bear spray now firmly in her grasp. "Hey!" she yelled, her voice firm but shaky. "Go on! Get out of here!" The forest fell silent again, save for the crackling fire and the pounding of her heart. Sophie strained, her ears waiting for some sign of movement, but none came. She took a deep breath and forced a laugh, trying to shake off the nerves. "You're losing it," she said to herself. "Probably just a deer." Still, the unease lingered. She decided to douse the fire and turn in for the night. She poured water over the flames, watching the steam rise as the last embers hissed and died. The darkness immediately felt heavier, pressing in from all sides. Once inside her tent, Sophie zipped the door tightly and crawled into her sleeping bag. She reached for her flashlight and set it beside her, its faint glow providing a small sense of security. Her cheek throbbed where the cold air had nipped at it earlier, and she pulled the sleeping bag tighter around her. "Tomorrow will be better," she murmured, her eyes fluttering shut. "Just get some sleep." The rustling sound returned, faint but persistent, like something brushing against the undergrowth. Sophie's eyes snapped open, her body rigid. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and quick. The sound seemed to circle the campsite, pausing intermittently before continuing. Sophie sat up, her hand fumbling for the flashlight. She clicked. It on and shone the beam at the tent walls, the thin fabric casting a dim, distorted view of the outside. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted. "Okay, that's enough," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her chest. She unzipped the tent just enough to peer out, her headlamp cutting through the inky blackness. The fire pit was dark and cold, the surrounding trees standing tall and silent like sentinels. A sudden gust of wind rustled the branches overhead, causing Sophie to flinch. She scanned the area with the light, her breath visible in the chilly air. Still nothing. She zipped the tent back up and leaned against the wall, her hand resting on the bear spray. "Whatever it is, it'll move on," she told herself, though her voice betrayed her doubt. She lay back down, forcing her eyes shut, but sleep wouldn't come. Every tiny sound felt like an alarm, her senses heightened to the point of exhaustion. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Sophie wasn't sure. She felt trapped in a liminal space, caught between sleep and hyper-awareness. The forest outside remained an enigma, its secrets hidden in shadows and silence. Finally, the first light of dawn began to seep through the tent fabric, washing the world in a pale grey. The unease of the night began to ebb, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. Sophie unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold morning air, her breath forming clouds as she exhaled. The forest was quiet, almost serene in the soft light. She glanced at her fire pit, her tent, the surrounding trees. Everything seemed untouched, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching. As Sophie packed up her gear, she resolved to put the night behind her, but deep down she knew the forest had changed for her. Its beauty was now tinged with an unsettling reminder. Out here she was not alone. Sophie set her backpack down beside the fire pit and stared at the horizon as the sun dipped lower, its orange glow spilling over the tree line. The dense forest around her grew darker, shadows lengthening and creeping closer. She tossed another log onto the fire, watching the flames catch and climb. The warmth was comforting, but she couldn't shake the unease lingering from earlier. The fire crackled and popped, sending small sparks dancing into the sky. Sophie hugged her knees to her chest and glanced at the tent behind her. It stood, still and quiet, a tiny refuge in the vast wilderness. The Rockies had always been her escape, but tonight the solitude felt oppressive. She could feel the forest's eyes on her, an ancient, watchful presence just beyond the glow of the fire. I'm being ridiculous," she muttered to herself, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the night. She grabbed her thermos and took a sip of lukewarm cocoa, its sweetness doing little to calm her nerves. Her gaze drifted to the food canister stashed far from the camp. She had done everything right, followed all the guidelines, kept her campsite clean, stored her food properly. But her gut told her something was off. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no distant howl of a coyote, not even the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. The sudden snap of a branch shattered the stillness. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes darted toward the sound, but the fire's light didn't reach far enough to reveal anything. She strained her ears, listening for movement, but all she heard was her own heartbeat pounding in her chest. "Probably just a deer," she whispered, trying to convince herself. Her fingers clenched around the bear spray resting on her lap. Nothing to freak out about. Another sound, a low, almost imperceptible rustling, came from the same direction. Sophie's grip on the canister tightened. She stood slowly, her legs stiff and shaky, and took a cautious step toward the edge of the firelight. "Hey," she called out, her voice echoing through the trees. "Go on, get out of here." The rustling stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Sophie's eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. The woods seemed to hold their breath again, an unsettling stillness that made her skin crawl. Then she saw it. Two faint reflective glimmers caught in the beam of her headlamp, eyes low to the ground and fixed on her. Her stomach dropped. She knew those eyes weren't a deer's. "Shit," she breathed, stepping back toward the fire. "Go away," she shouted, her voice trembling. She waved the bear spray in front of her, her thumb poised on the trigger. "Get out of here." The eyes didn't move. Sophie's mind raced. She remembered the ranger's advice. Stand tall, make noise. Don't turn your back. She grabbed a metal pot from beside the fire pit and banged it with a rock, the sharp clang echoing through the trees. "Leave!" she yelled again, her voice cracking. "Go on, get out of here!" The eyes shifted, rising higher as the figure moved. A shadowy shape emerged from the darkness, a massive grizzly, its thick fur illuminated in the firelight. It stood on all fours, its breath visible in the cold night air, nostrils flaring as it caught her scent. Sophie's legs felt like lead, her instincts screaming at her to run, but she knew better. She held her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The bear took a step closer, its claws clicking against the rocks. It wasn't charging, but it wasn't retreating either. It was curious, testing the boundaries. Sophie's throat felt dry as she clanged the pot again, her hands shaking. "Go away," she shouted, her voice rising in desperation. The bear stopped, its massive head tilting slightly. For a moment, Sophie thought it might turn back. Her hope was short-lived as the bear suddenly huffed, a deep, guttural sound that made her blood run cold. It took another step forward, its size even more imposing up close. Sophie fumbled with the bear spray, her fingers slipping on the canister. "Don't do this," she muttered, her breath shallow. "Please don't do this." The bear huffed again, its muscles tensing as it shifted its weight. Sophie felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a predator, every nerve in her body screaming for her to move, to act. She aimed the bear spray, her thumb pressing down on the trigger. A powerful jet of orange mist shot out, engulfing the bear's face. The animal roared, a deep, guttural sound of surprise and anger, and stumbled back, pawing at its snout. Sophie took the opportunity to back away slowly, her knees trembling with each step. "Get out of here," she yelled again, her voice shaking but determined. She kept the bear spray aimed at the animal, ready to fire another burst if necessary. The bear huffed and shook its head, clearly disoriented. After a tense moment, it turned and lumbered back into the darkness, the sound of its heavy footsteps fading into the night. Sophie didn't move for what felt like an eternity, her entire body trembling. The fire crackled behind her, its light casting dancing shadows on the trees. She finally exhaled, a shaky, uneven breath that felt like the first in minutes. She collapsed onto the log by the fire, her legs giving out beneath her. Her hands were still clenched around the bear spray, her knuckles white. "Holy shit," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The woods around her were silent again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, charged. Sophie knew the bear could still be out there watching from the shadows. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced at her tent, the flimsy fabric suddenly seeming woefully inadequate. She wasn't sure if she'd be able to sleep, but she knew she couldn't stay outside all night. With shaking hands, she doused the fire, the darkness immediately, closing in around her. She crawled into her tent, her bear spray and flashlight within easy reach. As she lay in her sleeping bag, every sound outside made her jump. A rustle of leaves, the snap of a distant branch. Her mind replayed the encounter over and over, each detail etched into her memory. She knew she wouldn't forget this night, not for a long time. The tent felt suffocating. The thin nylon walls offered no real protection, and Sophie's mind raced with the memory of the bear's hulking form illuminated in the firelight. Every noise outside now carried a weight of danger, each rustle of the wind an ominous signal. Her fingers gripped the bear spray tightly, her knuckles aching, and she kept the flashlight aimed at the tent door. She lay motionless, ears straining, to catch any sound beyond the steady thrum of her heart. Minutes ticked by like hours, her breathing shallow as she fought to stay calm. The bear had retreated, but the primal instinct inside her screamed it wasn't gone for good. Another sound broke the stillness, a soft crunch, deliberate and slow, like a heavy foot pressing down on fallen leaves. Sophie's body tensed, her heart pounding in her ears. "No, no, no," she whispered under her breath, gripping the bear spray even tighter. She knew it was back. The sound grew louder, circling the campsite. Sophie's flashlight beam wavered as her hand trembled, illuminating the faint outline of claw marks on the inside of the tent from where the bear had swiped earlier. She swallowed hard, the raw scratch on her cheek stinging as sweat dripped into it. She took a shaky breath and forced herself to speak. "Go away," she yelled, her voice cracking with fear. "I'm armed! I'll use this!" The crunching stopped. For a moment the silence felt deafening. Then came the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, low and guttural, just outside the tent. Sophie's stomach twisted as the outline of a massive shadow appeared against the tent wall, backlit by the dim moonlight. She froze, unable to look away as the bear's snout pressed against the fabric. The thin material caved inward slightly, the bear sniffing loudly, searching. Its breath was hot and damp, seeping through the tent wall and filling Sophie's nose, with the rank scent of the wild. Her grip on the bear spray was so tight her hand ached. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, just leave." The bear didn't move. Its massive paw scraped against the ground outside, and Sophie could hear the sound of its claws dragging over dirt and rock. It huffed once, a sharp and almost irritated sound, before pressing harder against the tent. Sophie's voice shook as she called out again, "Go away, leave me alone." Her words felt futile, swallowed by the bear's presence. The bear let out a low growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the thin fabric. Sophie's breath hitched. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. With a surge of adrenaline, she pointed the bear spray at the shadow and pressed the trigger. A fiery burst of orange mist sprayed through the mesh vent at the top of the tent. The bear roared, a deafening, guttural sound of pain and fury, and reared back. Sophie scrambled to her knees, unzipping the tent in one swift motion. She burst out into the cold night air, her flashlight and bear spray in hand, ready to face whatever came next. The bear was retreating, shaking its massive head and pawing at its face. Its roar echoed through the forest, the sound reverberating in Sophie's chest. She stumbled backward, keeping the bear spray aimed at the animal, her finger on the trigger. "Go, get out of here!" she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. The bear hesitated, its dark eyes locked on her. For a terrifying moment, Sophie thought it might charge. Instead, it let out another huff, a sharp exhale that sent a plume of mist into the cold air, and turned away. It lumbered into the darkness, its massive form disappearing into the shadows. Sophie stood there, shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She kept the bear spray raised, waiting, listening for any sign that it might come back. The forest was silent again, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. After what felt like an eternity, she lowered her arm, the weight of the spray canister suddenly too much to bear. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the ground, her knees hitting the cold earth. She pressed her hands to her face, the reality of the situation finally crashing down on her. Her voice came out in a choked whisper, "I can't do this." The campsite was a mess. Her tent, once neatly pitched, sagged on one side where the bear had pressed against it. The smell of pepper spray lingered in the air, a sharp, acrid reminder of how close she'd come to disaster. Sophie forced herself to her feet, her movements stiff and mechanical. She needed to leave. Staying here wasn't an option anymore. She grabbed her backpack from the shredded tent and stuffed what she could into it, her hands fumbling with every item. As she worked, her mind raced. The nearest ranger station was miles away, a grueling trek even in daylight. But she couldn't wait until morning. The bear had already shown it wasn't afraid to come back. She glanced at her watch, 3:12 a.m. The darkness stretched on, unyielding. "Just get to the trail," she told herself, her voice trembling. "You can do this." She slung the backpack over her shoulders, the weight pressing down on her sore muscles. With the bear spray in one hand and her flashlight in the other, Sophie set off into the forest, her footsteps crunching softly on the leaf-strewn path. The darkness was oppressive, the beam of her flashlight barely penetrating the thick canopy above. Every sound set her on edge, a distant rustle, the hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig underfoot. She couldn't tell if the bear was following her, but the thought kept her moving, her pace quickening despite the fatigue pulling at her limbs. She whispered to herself as she walked, her voice a fragile thread in the darkness. "You've got this, Sophie. Just keep going, don't stop." The cold bit at her face, and her injured cheek throbbed with each step. Her legs ached, her breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. The memory of the bear's growl, the weight of its presence, drove her forward. Finally, after what felt like hours, the faint outline of the trailhead came into view. Relief flooded through her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that she wasn't safe yet. She needed to find help, to get to the ranger station and report what had happened. Sophie took one last look over her shoulder at the dark forest behind her. The shadows seemed to watch her, the bear's memory imprinted on every tree. She turned back to the trail and kept walking, each step taking her closer to safety and farther from the nightmare she would never forget. The faint light of dawn began to creep over the horizon as Sophie stumbled onto the narrow dirt trail. Her legs felt like lead, her breathing shallow and uneven. The icy morning air stung her scratched face, but she welcomed the cold. It was a reminder that she was still alive. Her flashlight flickered weakly before sputtering out, leaving her with only the dim pre-dawn light to guide her. She cursed under her breath, shaking it uselessly. Great, just perfect. The forest around her was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. The bear could still be out there, hidden in the shadows. Every step she took felt too loud, each crunch of leaves underfoot echoing in her ears. She tightened her grip on the bear spray, her only lifeline in this endless wilderness. Ahead, the trail wound sharply upward, leading to a ridge she knew offered a view of the valley below. It was her best chance to assess her position and, if lucky, spot the ranger station in the distance. Sophie quickened her pace, her muscles protesting with every step. As she climbed, the events of the night replayed in her mind like a broken record. The bear's massive shadow, the sound of its claws scraping against the earth, the primal roar when the spray hit its face. It all felt too vivid, too real. Her hands shook as she adjusted her pack, the memory refusing to let her go. "You've got to keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse. "Get to the top. Focus." The ridge was steeper than she remembered, and her exhaustion made the climb feel insurmountable. She paused halfway, leaning against a boulder to catch her breath. Her chest burned, and every muscle in her legs screamed for rest, but she couldn't afford to stop for long. A distant snap of a twig made her freeze. The sound echoed faintly through the trees, but it was enough to set her heart racing again. She spun around, scanning the dense forest behind her. Nothing moved, but the paranoia that had gripped her all night tightened its hold. "Probably a deer," she muttered, though she didn't believe it. Her fingers tightened on the bear spray. Pushing herself off the rock, she forced her legs to keep going, one foot in front of the other. The ridge was close now, the ground leveling out as she neared the top. The sight of the valley below finally came into view, and Sophie let out a shaky breath. The expanse stretched out before her, a patchwork of green and brown bathed in the pale light of dawn. Far in the distance, she spotted the faint outline of a building, small and indistinct but unmistakably man-made. Relief washed over her. It had to be the ranger station. "There," she said aloud, her voice cracking with emotion. "I can make it." But the moment of relief was short-lived. A low, guttural sound carried through the air, freezing her in place. It was unmistakable, the deep huff of a bear, closer than she had dared to imagine. Sophie's blood turned to ice. Slowly, she turned her head toward the sound, and there it was, the grizzly, its massive form emerging from the tree, line below, its eyes locked on her, its breath visible in the cold morning air. "Oh God," she whispered, backing away instinctively. Her foot caught on a loose rock, and she stumbled, nearly falling. The bear huffed again, its posture low and deliberate, every movement a calculated step closer. Sophie's mind raced. She knew she couldn't outrun it, not on this uneven terrain. She had to stand her ground. Raising the bear spray, she shouted as loudly as she could, her voice shaking but forceful. "Get back! Stay away!" The bear paused, tilting its head slightly as if sizing her up. Sophie banged her flashlight against a rock, the metallic clang echoing through the air. "Go on, get out of here." For a moment, it seemed to work. The bear hesitated, its massive head swinging side to side. But then it took another step forward, its claws scraping against the rocky ground. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest as she prepared to use the spray again. Her hand shook as she aimed, her thumb pressing down on the trigger. The spray erupted in a fiery burst, the orange mist enveloping the bear's face. The animal roared, a deafening sound that seemed to shake the ground beneath her. It pawed at its snout, shaking its head violently as it backed away. "Go!" Sophie screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "Leave me alone!" The bear let out another roar, its massive body twisting in frustration. For a moment, it seemed torn between retreating and attacking. Sophie stood her ground, the canister still aimed, ready to fire again if needed. Finally, the bear turned, lumbering back toward the trees. It moved slowly at first, then broke into a lumbering trot, disappearing into the forest. Sophie didn't dare move until the sound of its heavy footsteps faded completely. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably. The adrenaline coursing through her veins left her lightheaded, her vision swimming as she tried to catch her breath. She looked down at her hands, still clutching the empty bear spray canister. Her knuckles were white, her fingers cramping. From the grip, tears streamed down her face, a mixture of relief and sheer exhaustion. "You're okay," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "You're okay. It's gone." She sat there for a while, staring out at the valley below. The ranger station was still there, a distant beacon of safety. Gathering what little strength she had left, Sophie pushed herself to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced them to move. With the empty canister in one hand and her flashlight in the other, Sophie began her descent toward the valley. The thought of the bear lingered in the back of her mind, but she knew she couldn't let it stop her. She had survived this long. She could make it the rest of the way. The hike down the ridge was slow, each step more difficult than the last. Sophie's legs burned with every movement, her muscles tight and sore from the strain. The events of the past hours still seemed surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't shake off. Her body was exhausted, but her mind wouldn't let go of the memory of the bear, its massive presence, the terrible sound of its growl, the way it seemed to toy with her before retreating. The light of morning was beginning to break fully through the trees, painting the forest in soft golden hues. But the beauty of the landscape did nothing to ease the unease tightening her chest. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig, sent her heart into overdrive, and she kept looking over her shoulder, half expecting the bear to reappear at any moment. The trail became steeper as she descended, the loose gravel making each step treacherous. She had to concentrate, on her footing, willing her body to keep moving. The ranger station was still far away, and she didn't know if she had the strength to make it on her own. Her throat felt dry, her body craving water, but she didn't dare stop to rest, not with the bear still fresh in her mind. After what felt like an eternity, Sophie reached the base of the ridge and stumbled into a clearing. The trail ahead was smoother here, more level. It was then that she allowed herself a brief moment to pause, leaning against a tree to catch her breath. "Darcy, just a little longer," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. She scanned the area, the morning light filtering through the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the distance, but it was only the wind stirring the branches. Sophie's pulse quickened, and she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. She couldn't afford to be paranoid. She had to keep it together. Pushing herself away from the tree, she started forward again, her pace slower now, but steady. As she neared the first bend in the trail, she saw the outline of a small building in the distance, the ranger station. A sense of relief flooded through her, though she couldn't relax yet. She still had to get there, to find someone who could help her, to make sure the bear wouldn't come back. It took another 20 minutes before Sophie reached the station, her heart pounding with anticipation. The building looked small but sturdy, surrounded by a few parked vehicles. She could see the silhouette of a man standing on the porch, a coffee mug in hand. "Hey!" Sophie shouted, her voice hoarse. She waved her arms frantically, her body shaking with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I need help." The man on the porch turned, squinting into the distance before stepping down the stairs. Sophie stumbled toward him, her legs almost giving out beneath her. He caught sight of her bloodied face, her disheveled appearance, and his expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with an accent she couldn't quite place. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning her as if trying to piece together what had happened. I was attacked by a bear," Sophie gasped, her voice shaking. She could barely get the words out, the memory of the attack rushing back in vivid detail. I need to report it." His brow furrowed and he glanced over his shoulder as if considering something. "You were attacked by a bear. You're lucky to be alive." "I know, I don't know how I made it out. I need help," Sophie pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, I need to report this." The man nodded and moved to the side, opening the door to the station. "Come inside, we'll get you looked at." Sophie followed him inside, her legs trembling as she crossed the threshold. The station was small, with a few desks cluttered with papers and maps of the surrounding area. A woman behind the counter looked up from her computer and immediately stood when she saw Sophie's condition. "Good Lord, what happened to you?" the woman asked, rushing over to Sophie's side. "You look like you've been through hell." "A bear," Sophie repeated, still breathless. "It was huge. I don't know why it didn't finish. The job, it just left. But I need to report it. Someone needs to know what happened." The man who had greeted Sophie nodded, his face serious. "We've had reports of increased bear activity in this area lately. Seems like they've been more aggressive than usual. We'll have to document this, but first let's get you cleaned up." Sophie didn't argue. She allowed herself to be guided to a small first aid station in the back of the room. The woman started cleaning the shallow gashes on her face, gently dabbing at the blood and dirt with antiseptic wipes. Sophie winced as the sting of the alcohol hit the cuts. "I've seen a lot of injuries from animals over the years," the woman said, her voice steady. "But I've never seen someone walk away from a bear attack like this." "I didn't walk away. I ran," Sophie muttered, her voice barely a whisper. The man stood by the door watching as the woman worked. "We'll file the report with the local wildlife authorities, but I've got to warn you, these kinds of things don't always get the attention they deserve. Bears are dangerous, but they're also a part of the environment here. It's not unusual for rangers to get a report and do little more than issue a warning." Sophie's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, do little more?" "I mean," the man said slowly, "they might track the bear's movements maybe, put up a few more signs or warnings, but unless it's a serious incident, something like a fatality, it doesn't always make it higher up the chain. Wildlife management's priorities tend to shift." Sophie's head swam. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had fought for her life, for God's sake, and now the authorities might brush it off. I can't believe this," she muttered, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I was almost killed, and they're just going to shrug it off?" The woman, who had been silently tending to her wounds, looked up, her expression sympathetic. "Unfortunately, yeah. They'll do their job, but the reality is they can't take action for every single bear sighting. You'll be fine, though. You're alive. That's what matters." Sophie clenched her fists, the words stinging. "I'm not fine," she said sharply. "I'm scared. I won't sleep until I know that bear is gone, that it won't hurt someone else." The man's eyes softened, and he stepped closer. "We'll do what we can, but if it's any consolation, you're one of the lucky ones. Bears don't always give people a second chance." Sophie bit her lip, fighting back the tears that threatened to rise again. It wasn't just the physical pain that hurt, it was the helplessness, the knowledge that she could be sent back, out into the wilderness with no real reassurance that the bear wouldn't come back, that it wouldn't attack someone else. She forced herself to stand, her legs still shaking but firm enough to hold her. "I appreciate the help, but I need to get out of here. I can't stay in these woods anymore." The man nodded and gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder. "We'll make sure you're safe, don't worry. But if you want to leave the area, that's your choice. The last thing we want is for anyone else to get hurt." Sophie stood there for a moment, her emotions swirling. Finally, she nodded, her voice small. "I just want to go home." Sophie sat in the small, cluttered office at the ranger station, the report about the bear attack in front of her. Her mind felt foggy, as though she were detached from the reality of the moment, and yet the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on her chest. Her face was bandaged, her arms sore from the climb, and the adrenaline that had kept her moving for hours had long since worn off, leaving only exhaustion and a deep sense of unease. The man who had first greeted her, Ranger Mark, sat across from her, watching as she filled out the form. He didn't speak much, just letting her process everything in silence. Sophie's handwriting was shaky as she tried to recall every detail of the attack. The way the bear had appeared from the shadows, its massive body blocking out the little light that existed in the forest, how the air had smelled thick with its presence. "Do you need anything else?" Mark asked, his voice breaking the silence. "Water? Coffee?" Sophie looked up at him, her eyes heavy. "No, I'm fine. Just trying to get through this." She tapped the pen nervously against the paper. "You're sure there's nothing more you can do?" Mark's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest. "I can file the report, no problem, but we've got our hands full. I'm sure you understand. Bears are common around here, especially with the increasing traffic from hikers and campers. I'll let wildlife management know, but you'll need to understand that unless it's a bigger incident, like someone dying, it doesn't always get top priority." Sophie's chest tightened. She looked at him, her brow furrowed. "So what you're saying is this might get ignored, just because I'm alive?" Mark hesitated before answering. I'm not saying it'll be ignored, but there's a protocol, and it's complicated. We'll have to do a follow-up investigation, maybe track the bear's movements, make sure it doesn't pose a bigger threat. But the reality is, he paused, his tone more measured now, unless it's an immediate danger, there's a lot of paperwork, a lot of bureaucracy. Sophie stared at the sheet in front of her, feeling her anger rise again. She could still feel the bear's claws raking across her skin, the force of its swipe just inches from her face. It hadn't been some close call. It had been a brutal, calculated attack. And yet the system seemed to reduce it to paperwork, a routine. Report, her stomach twisted. I was attacked, she said, her voice quieter now, but still firm. It's not just a sighting, it was a real attack. Mark nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words, but there was little he could do. I know, and I don't want to downplay what happened to you, Sophie. You're lucky to be alive, but we're not the only ones making decisions on this. The higher-ups, wildlife managers, they'll look at the report and determine the next steps. I'll do everything I can to make sure it gets noticed. Sophie closed her eyes, trying to block out the frustration. I just want people to know the truth. I'm not asking for anything else. I don't want to go back to the woods, but I don't want this to happen to someone else. Mark studied her for a moment, his gaze softening again. I understand. I'll make sure to file it right. Make sure they know it was a serious incident. Sophie nodded, though she felt as though her words were falling on deaf ears. She knew better than to expect immediate action or to have her experience fully acknowledged. It was just another case, another statistic. Her face would be a memory, the scars a reminder, but everything else, everything that really mattered, would slip through the cracks. Thank you, she muttered, her voice small. Mark's gaze lingered on her a moment longer before he stood up, walking over to the door. I'm going to step outside for a bit, he said. Take your time. Phil, now the rest of the report, and if you need anything, I'll be fine, Sophie interrupted, her throat tight. Mark gave her a nod and left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Sophie sat there for a long moment, staring at the form in front of her. The words on the page seemed to blur together, as if they were written in a language she couldn't understand. It all felt so meaningless. How could a piece of paper, an official report, capture what had really happened? She was snapped out of her thoughts by a soft knock on the door. Hey, Sophie, came a voice from the other side. It was the woman who had helped her earlier, the one who had cleaned her wounds. Sophie stood and opened the door. I just wanted to check in on you, the woman said, her expression warm but serious. How are you doing? Sophie forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'm all right, just trying to figure out what happens next. I can't imagine what you're going through, the woman said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. But I do know that you're not alone in this. I've been working here for a long time and I've seen all sorts of things. And I know that sometimes the system doesn't work the way we want it to. But that doesn't mean you don't matter. Sophie's eyes flickered with emotion, and she swallowed hard. I feel like I don't matter, she admitted, her voice shaky. Like I'm just another person with a story no one will care about. A bear attack is a rare thing, and when it happens, it's just brushed aside. The woman sighed, her face softening. It's not right, but it's the reality we live with. Doesn't mean we can't try to make a difference, though. Sophie met her gaze, feeling the weight of the moment. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this feeling. I keep seeing it. The bear, it feels like it's still out there. It probably is, the woman said quietly, her voice steady. And maybe it'll be back, but you don't have to carry the fear forever. You've survived. And that's more than a lot of people can say. It's not about what happens next, Sophie. It's about how you move forward. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She didn't know if she was ready to move forward. The woods felt too vast, too full of threats she couldn't see. But in that moment, she realized that moving forward was the only choice she had. Thank you, Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman nodded, her eyes kind. Just take it one day at a time. Sophie watched her leave the room, the door clicking shut softly behind her. She turned back to the report in front of her. For the first time in hours, she took a deep breath and picked up the pen. She wasn't sure what the future held, but She knew she had to finish what she had started. Even if no one else would listen, even if no one else would care, she would make sure her story was heard. Sophie sat alone in her small apartment, the familiar hum of city life outside the window, doing little to drown out the noise in her mind. It had been 2 weeks since the attack. 2 weeks since the moment the bear's claws had torn through her tent, its massive paw grazing her face. The scars on her cheek were healing, but the memory of the attack was still fresh, replaying in her mind like a loop she couldn't escape. She had tried to move on, to focus on work and everyday life, but it felt like the forest, the bear, the fear. It was all still following her just behind the veil of normalcy. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table, scrolling through her contacts. There were a few people she could talk to about what happened, but none of them would understand. None of them had been there, had seen the terror she'd experienced. She hesitated before opening the message thread with her friend from the trip, Ellie. Ellie had been with her in the Rockies, just a few campsites over, but the woman was a casual hiker, and the encounter with the bear had been too much for her. Sophie had kept the details brief when she'd told her about the attack. Ellie had been concerned, of course, but she didn't seem to grasp the weight of what had happened. Maybe it's best I just don't talk about it anymore, Sophie thought, as she typed a message to Ellie. Hey, hope you're doing well, been thinking about the trip. Hope you're good. Ellie's reply came a few minutes later. I'm good, just busy with work. How's the healing going? Sophie smiled faintly as she typed back, It's all right, the scars are healing. Just been a lot to process, you know. Ellie's response was quick. Yeah, I bet. Glad you're okay. Still can't believe that happened. Let me know if you need anything. I will, Sophie replied, but she didn't feel like Ellie would understand. She felt the weight of her isolation, the gulf that had formed between herself and everyone who hadn't been there, hadn't seen the way the bear had stalked them, how it had swiped at her through the thin fabric of the tent, its growls echoing in her ears as the world seemed to slow down. Her phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. Sophie stared at the screen for a moment before answering, her heart racing a little. Hello? Sophie Turner? The voice on the other end was rough, but there was an air of professionalism to it. This is Sophie, she replied, cautiously. Hi, Sophie, this is Sheriff Daniels from the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department. I've got some follow-up questions about the bear incident you reported a couple weeks ago. Sophie's pulse quickened. She had been expecting some sort of follow-up, but hearing from law enforcement made her feel uneasy. Sure. What do you need? We've been looking into the bear's behavior in that area. It's not typical for a bear to go after a tent, especially a human in one. We've been doing some research into bear activity, and we've gotten a few more reports from hikers in the area. The thing is, this bear might not be acting alone. There's been a few more incidents similar to yours. We're trying to track it down. Sophie blinked, sitting up straighter. What do you mean, you think it's been attacking others too? It's possible. We're not sure, but there's been a cluster of sightings, and we're looking into it. We just want to confirm what happened from your side. Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Well, I told the ranger everything that happened when I filed the report. The bear was huge. I barely saw it before it attacked. It was fast, strong. I didn't stand a chance. I don't know if it was alone, but it felt like it was stalking me. Sheriff Daniels paused for a moment. Yeah, that's what we're hearing. It's rare for a bear to attack like that unless it feels threatened or desperate. We've ruled out the bear being rabid. It's just acting differently, and that worries us. Sophie felt a chill creep up her spine. So what happens now? Is the bear still out there? We're doing everything we can to track it down, but I'm not going to lie, Sophie. This is a dangerous situation. Bears like that don't just disappear. If you're still considering hiking or camping out in the area, I'd suggest against it. I won't be going back out there, Sophie said quickly, her voice steady but firm. I've had enough. I just want to be sure that it's stopped. No one else should have to go through what I did. I understand. We'll keep you updated as we learn more, Sheriff Daniels said. Just keep your guard up. We'll be in touch soon. The line went dead and Sophie stared at her phone for a long time, her hands trembling slightly. The conversation left her with more questions than answers. If the bear had attacked others, how many people had been caught in its path? Why hadn't she heard about these incidents before? And what was this thing really after? Sophie had thought. Her attack was a freak occurrence, a fluke, but now it seemed like something much darker was unfolding. Her thoughts drifted back to the night in the tent. The cold, the darkness, the overwhelming sense of danger. It had all felt so real, so raw. It still haunted her, and now knowing that the bear was still out there made her feel like she was caught in its shadow. But then another thought struck her. The bear was gone now, wasn't it? They hadn't found it. Could it be dead? Or had it simply moved on, finding new territory? Sophie pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. She had survived. That was what counted. But why did it still feel like the attack hadn't really ended? Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Ranger Mark. "Hi, Sophie. Just wanted to check in. We've received more reports from the area around your campsite. Bear sightings. Just wanted to let you know we're doing everything we can to track it down. Stay safe out there." Sophie's heart sank. The bear was still out there. She could feel it, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Even though she was hundreds of miles away, the fear followed her. She responded with a simple message. "Thanks, I'll stay safe," but in truth she didn't feel safe. Not anymore. Sophie stood in front of her bathroom mirror, studying the faint scars that traced the outline of her cheek. The tissue had healed, but the deep marks remained, a permanent reminder of that night in the Rockies. She reached up to touch them lightly, wincing as her fingers brushed the raised skin. The memory of the bear's claw, sharp and so close, surged back in a flood, its heavy breath the sound of its growls. It felt like it had happened yesterday, yet so much had changed since then. She let out a sigh and dropped her hand. The quiet of her apartment seemed almost suffocating today. Sophie hadn't been able to shake the thought that the bear was still out there somewhere. Despite the assurances from the rangers, despite the fact that they'd assured her the bear had been tracked and was no longer in the area, the nagging feeling of danger lingered. The phone on her desk buzzed, dragging her from her thoughts. She glanced over at it, half hoping it was a call or message from one of the rangers, maybe an update about the bear. But it was just Ellie, her old friend from the trip. "Hey, how are you? Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" Sophie paused, chewing on her lip. She hadn't been in the mood to talk much, but maybe it was time to have a real conversation with Ellie about what had happened, about the weight of it all. She typed back, "I'm doing better, but I've been thinking a lot about what happened out there. It's hard to explain." Ellie's reply came swiftly. "I can only imagine. I still can't believe you went through that. I'm glad you're okay, though. But you seem like you're holding a lot in. You want to talk?" Sophie felt her chest tighten, but the loneliness of it all urged her to answer. She needed to share this with someone, even if Ellie wouldn't fully understand. "I don't know. It's just hard to shake it off. It's not like I can just forget about it. It's there every time I close my eyes." Ellie's response was quick, empathetic. "I get it, but you don't have to go through this alone. You were there, Sophie. You survived. And that's what matters. Just remember, you're stronger than you think." Sophie stared at her phone, her mind racing. She appreciated Ellie's words, but they didn't help the gnawing sensation that something wasn't right. The bear attack hadn't just been an isolated event. Sophie could feel it. The weight of the forest, the stillness of the night air, the sense of being watched. It was as if the world had shifted slightly, as if she were walking in the shadow of something else, something more primal. She set the phone down, trying to distract herself by unpacking the gear from her hiking bag, sorting through the scattered items. A forgotten trail map caught her eye and she picked it up. It was the map of the area near her campsite, the one she had used on the trip. The lines, the routes, the names of the various peaks and valleys, it all seemed so far away now. The Rockies, the trees, the wildness. It felt like a different life, but the bear, the fear that night, it hadn't left her. A knock at the door startled her, and she quickly stood up, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Sophie walked to the door and opened it, half expecting to see a delivery driver or a neighbor. Instead, it was Mark, the ranger who had been in contact with her after the incident. "Sophie," he said, giving her a small nod, "can I come in?" Sophie stepped aside, surprised but not unwilling. "Of course, come in. What's going on?" He walked in, glancing around the apartment briefly before meeting her gaze. He didn't look surprised to find her home, but there was an unease in his posture that caught her attention. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, Mark said, his voice low, almost reluctant. But I wanted to talk to you about something. Sophie furrowed her brow. What's going on? Mark hesitated for a moment, then ran a hand through his short, dark hair. It's about the bear. We've been doing more research on the area you were in. And well, there's something I didn't tell you. Sophie's stomach churned. What do you mean? What is it? He sighed, glancing at the door as though making sure no one else was around. There's been a spike in bear sightings in that part of the park. And not just any bears. This particular bear or bears have been acting differently. I can't say for sure, but it looks like this bear might have been targeting people, specifically people who were camping alone. Sophie's breath caught. She had always known something had been off, but hearing it confirmed made her skin crawl. What do you mean, targeting? Bears are opportunistic hunters. They're not supposed to be aggressive toward humans unless they feel threatened. But these animals, they've been attacking at night, going after campsites, not just food. It's unusual behavior, and after looking into it more, we've found other campers who had similar encounters. None as close as yours, though. You were lucky to get away. Sophie's pulse was racing. What does that mean? Are these bears still out there? Are they more dangerous than we thought? Mark took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. We don't know, but we're monitoring the situation. We think they might be more desperate than usual. We're concerned about the possibility of it happening again. Sophie felt a wave of nausea hit her. What does this mean for me, Mark? You said I was lucky. What about the others? We're going to keep patrolling the area. Make sure people know what to do if they encounter a bear, he said. But his voice lacked certainty. But honestly, Sophie, I can't promise it won't happen again. The air between them felt heavy, the weight of his words settling in the room like a cold draft. Sophie swallowed hard, her chest tightening. So, but what am I supposed to do now? Mark's face softened. You need to stay vigilant. Don't go back into those areas, not until we know more. And if you do decide to go camping again, be sure you're with others. Never go alone. Bears can sense vulnerability. She nodded, the reality of it all sinking in. She had barely escaped with her life that night. And now the idea of facing it again, of being out there alone, seemed almost impossible. Mark stood there for a moment, silent, as if weighing his next words. Sophie, I know you love the outdoors, but please, for your own safety, take this seriously. The bears we're dealing with right now, they're not behaving like normal wildlife. She didn't answer at first, her mind racing with the implications. The bear had been stalking her. It had been after something more than food. Thank you for coming by, Sophie finally said, her voice quiet but firm. I'll stay safe. I don't plan on going back out there anytime soon. Mark gave her a small, tight-lipped smile. Good. Just keep us posted if you hear anything or see anything unusual. I will, Sophie said, but inside she was already wondering if she could ever go back to the peace of the wilderness. The bear wasn't just out there. It was in her mind now too, a constant reminder of the terror that could strike without warning. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the world had changed forever. Ever since the attack, everything had felt different, like the walls between the ordinary world and something darker had cracked wide open. No matter how many times she told herself she was fine, no matter how many reassuring words from friends and family she heard, it all felt hollow. The night in the Rockies had become more than a simple camping accident. It had become a ghost that haunted her waking hours, its claws digging deeper with each passing day. She hadn't been camping since, and as the weeks passed, Sophie found herself avoiding the outdoors, unable to look at a trail map or the gentle sway of trees without feeling a chill run down her spine. But there was something even more unsettling, the absence of the bear. That night she'd left the campsite in a frantic scramble, but the bear had never truly been dealt with. Mark had assured her that the animal had been tracked, but Sophie wondered, how much can we really know? She sat at her desk now, her mind far from the work in front of her. It was late in the afternoon, but she couldn't focus on the emails, piling up, or the project deadline she was fast approaching. A steady rain pattered against the windows, its steady rhythm like a drumbeat that echoed the pounding of her heart from that night. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her out of her reverie. It was a message from Ellie, her old friend from the trip. Sophie hadn't spoken to her much since that night, but Ellie had checked in from time to time, offering support in her own way. "Hey, I was thinking about you today. We should catch up soon. Let me know when you're free." Sophie hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. She could feel the weight of the past month pressing on her chest. Ellie didn't know how bad things had gotten. She didn't know how the memory of that bear's paw, its massive, jagged claws slicing through the fabric of her tent, had become a recurring nightmare. Ellie didn't know that Sophie still heard the growl in her sleep, that every rustle in the trees set her heart racing. Sophie set the phone down, looking out the window at the rain. She didn't want to be alone in this anymore. Not with the memories. Not with the fear that refused to let her go. And so, without another thought, she typed back, "I'm free tonight. Let's meet up." An hour later, Sophie was sitting across from Ellie at a small cafe, the warm mug of coffee between them offering a fragile sense of normalcy. Ellie's presence was like a lifeline, a reminder of the life Sophie used to have before everything changed. "So," Ellie began, her voice light but with an edge of concern. "How are you really doing, Soph?" Sophie's eyes flickered to the side, her fingers tightening around the ceramic cup. The noise of the cafe seemed far away, as if the world outside had paused for just a moment. "It's been hard," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about that night. The bear, everything. I can't get it out of my head." Ellie reached across the table, her hand gently resting on Sophie's. "I know. You never mentioned much about it when we talked after. I thought you'd be fine, but now I'm starting to realize that maybe you're not." Sophie's chest tightened, but there was something comforting in Ellie's words. She hadn't expected this level of understanding. She hadn't expected to feel seen, really seen, by anyone since the attack. "I feel like I'm losing my grip on it," Sophie confessed, a tremor in her voice. The attack, it wasn't just the bear, it was everything. The way it felt, the fear, how I couldn't even scream, the way it all happened so fast, so unreal. Ellie nodded, her face soft with empathy. "I can't even imagine what that felt like. I remember the way you talked about the trip, how excited you were to get away. You didn't deserve any of that, Sophie. I know, but now it's like every time I hear something moving in the trees, I feel like I'm back there. The rustling, the branches snapping. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again, not out there, not in the woods." Ellie was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on Sophie. "But you still want to go back out there, don't you?" Sophie's heart skipped. She didn't want to admit it, not out loud, but it was the truth. She wanted to go back. She wanted to confront the fear, to find some kind of closure. But the thought of being alone in the wilderness without a shred of safety made her stomach turn. "I don't know," she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I think a part of me does, but I'm scared. Scared of what could happen or what I'll feel out there. I feel like it would be easier to never go back." Ellie leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You can't let it define you, Sophie. I know it's tough, but you're stronger than this. You can't let one experience control the rest of your life." Sophie swallowed hard, blinking back tears that she hadn't even realized had gathered. She looked at Ellie, her friend's words sinking deep. Stronger than this. Could she really be? Could she truly overcome what had happened? "I don't know if I can," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "I don't know if I can be the same again." Ellie smiled gently. "You don't have to be the same. Just don't let the fear win. You can still enjoy the things you love, the things that make you who you are. The outdoors, it's part of you, Sophie. It always will be, but you need to heal first." Sophie nodded slowly. Ellie was right. She wasn't the same, and maybe she didn't have to be. But the thought of facing the wild again, of standing in the same spot where everything had unraveled, made her feel small and insignificant. Still, a part of her, a deep, aching part, wanted to push through, to reclaim the joy she once felt, to remind herself that the world wasn't defined by the things that had happened to her. "I think maybe I'll go back one day," Sophie said quietly. "Not yet, but maybe someday, just to prove to myself that I'm not afraid anymore." Ellie's smile widened. "That's the spirit, Sophie. Just take your time. It's not a race. You'll get there when you're ready." The rest of the evening passed in a haze, a quiet understanding hanging between them as Sophie tried to make sense of what Ellie had said. She wasn't sure when she'd be ready to go back to the place that had nearly taken her life, but the idea of reclaiming her space in the world, of not letting fear define her, was something she could hold on to for now. As she left the cafe, later that night, Sophie felt the weight of the conversation lingering, settling deep in her chest. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she had a path forward. The morning after her conversation with Ellie, Sophie woke with a feeling of unease that clung to her like a heavy fog. The sunlight that streamed through the blinds seemed too bright, almost mocking in its warmth, as if the world hadn't witnessed the events that had changed her life. She could still feel the scratches on her cheek, a light stinging from the memory of the bear's claws. But the pain was more than physical. It was the emotional scars that haunted her now, the fear, the helplessness, the overwhelming sense that something primal had been awakened in her. Sophie pushed herself out of bed, the crisp air of the early morning cutting through her as she walked to the window, staring out at the peaceful suburban street. It was hard to believe that only weeks ago she had been in the wilderness surrounded by towering pine trees and the majesty of the Rockies. That night felt like a lifetime ago, but it was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. She'd heard the rumors, of course, the locals saying that the bear who attacked her had been spotted nearby, that it was becoming bolder, more aggressive. It was one thing to hear those stories in passing, another thing entirely to know that it was that bear, the one that had torn through her tent in a violent frenzy, that was still out there. But Sophie wasn't going to let fear control her. She couldn't. She had made that decision when she spoke to Ellie, when she realized that she couldn't let that night define her. And yet, as she gathered her things and prepared for her hike to the nearby park, a quiet doubt crept in. Was she ready for this? Was it too soon? She shook her head, trying to clear the doubt. She couldn't keep hiding. Sophie grabbed her jacket and headed out the door, trying to push the nagging thoughts to the back of her mind. The park was only a short walk from her apartment, a familiar place where she'd gone countless times before. The air was cool, crisp, and the trees stood like old friends, the faint rustle of leaves reminding her of her previous visits. It should have been a place of comfort, a place where she could reconnect with nature and feel some semblance of normalcy. As she walked along the trail, her footsteps crunching on the gravel, Sophie felt the tension in her body. She was hyper-aware of every sound, the chirping of birds, the crack of a twig in the distance, the rush of wind through the branches. Her heart raced, though there was no immediate danger. She couldn't help herself. Her body had learned to react before her mind could catch up. The bear's attack had imprinted itself into her instincts, the fight-or-flight response triggered by the smallest of sounds. Sophie stopped at a bench near the edge of the trail, pulling out her phone to check the time. She had been walking for a while now, trying to regain her sense of control, but the fear had never truly left. The stillness of the park, the sense that she was alone, set her nerves on edge. "You're being paranoid," she thought. "There's no bear out here, just enjoy the peace." But then she heard something. It was a distant crack, a sharp snap of a twig, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Sophie's heart lurched in her chest. She tried to stay calm, telling herself it was just a deer, a raccoon, or a squirrel. But the sound came again, louder this time and closer. Her breath quickened. No, she thought, it's not possible, not here. She turned to look down the trail behind her. Her eyes scanned the trees, the bushes, the ground. Nothing. The trail was still. The rustling had stopped. For a moment, everything was normal again. But her pulse was racing, her hands shaking, the quiet hum of panic buzzing in her ears. The sound came again. Sophie froze. This time, the crack of a branch was followed by the unmistakable low rumble of something, someone, moving through the brush. Her instincts flared to life. That low growl, that unmistakable deep sound that set her heart pounding in her chest. It was too close. She turned quickly, looking around for an escape route. Her eyes darted back to the path, but there was no sign of movement. Stay calm, she told herself. "You're overreacting. You've been through this. It's just a deer." But the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. And then she saw it. a flash of movement in the shadows. The bear. Its dark form loomed in the distance, its massive silhouette barely visible through the thicket of trees. It was moving slowly, methodically, but there was no mistaking what it was. The bear's eyes glinted in the dim light, its powerful frame seeming to fill the space between Sophie and the trees. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. The fear she had pushed down so many times now surged back to the surface. Her body was frozen, her mind scrambling for a way out. She had no weapon, no defense, nothing but her wits and the knowledge of the bear's deadly instincts. The bear wasn't charging. It wasn't attacking yet. But Sophie knew the difference now. She had seen it up close, felt its claws tear through the tent. She knew how quickly things could escalate. A rush of adrenaline shot through her. Sophie moved, her legs trembling beneath her as she bolted down the trail, her breath ragged in. Her chest. She didn't know if the bear was following or not, but she couldn't risk it. Her feet flew over the path, each step a desperate attempt to outrun the primal terror surging through her veins. She kept running, not daring to look. Behind her. She heard the rustling again, but it was farther off now, fading into the distance. She didn't slow down until she reached the park exit, where the safety of the busy street and the presence of other people washed over her in a rush of relief. Sophie stood there, panting, her hands on her knees as she tried to catch her breath. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her mind raced to process what had just happened. She had come so close, too close. The bear hadn't attacked, at least not yet, but the fear, the raw terror that had gripped her, was more than enough to remind her that the wilderness had its dangers. She glanced back over her shoulder, the familiar trees now a distant memory. The bear was gone and the park was once again quiet, but for Sophie the reality of the attack had sunk in deeper than ever before. As she made her way back home, Sophie realized something. She had been running from the fear for weeks, but it would always be there, lurking in the corners of her mind. She couldn't outrun it forever. But she wasn't going to let it control her either. Not again. Maybe one day she would find the courage to return to the wilderness. Maybe in time she would reclaim the sense of peace that had once drawn her to the mountains. But for now, Sophie was just going to breathe, one step at a time, through the fear.